Well, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to look at my notes there and realise that in my rush to get out and canvass for the Lisbon Treaty this morning, I brought the wrong notes with me. So instead of reading what my office told me to say, I'm going to have to tell you the truth. Can I say, first of all, I'm glad to see that Noel Dore is here on my left-hand side, like an angel guardian, I hope. On my first day in the Department of Foreign Affairs, I was briefed by Noel Dore, who was then the Secretary, and when we were finished the briefing, he said to me, "Well, now, Minister, is there anything you'd like to say to me?" And I said to him, in total innocence and sincerity, "Well, Secretary, there's two things I don't like doing." I said, "I don't like travelling and I don't like doing business over meals." And he said, "Minister, you're in the wrong department." Anyhow, can I just say to you that it's a great pleasure to be here this morning. When I went out to the European Parliament, I didn't know anything about development aid, nothing whatsoever about development aid. I had written a policy on development aid once, and that was about, I was Foreign Affairs spokesman for Fine Gael twice, but every Foreign Affairs spokesman has a spokesman on development aid who takes care of that. And in the Department of Foreign Affairs, when I was there was a separate minister for development aid. So I only knew peripherally about the issues dealing with development aid. And I know now just how little I knew then and how little I still know. But when I went there was a vacancy on the Foreign Affairs Committee, which John Cushnahan had vacated. He didn't stand again. It was presumed I'd want that, and I didn't want it. I wanted to go on the Development Committee to learn about development because, first of all, I needed to fill that gap in my own knowledge of foreign affairs, and secondly, because of the devastating situation in the world. I don't need to remind you, but just to go through some of the figures. Almost 1 billion people go to bed hungry every night. The population of the world is only a little over 6 billion. 900 and odd million don't have clean water. Every day, almost 16,000 children die from hunger-related causes, one child every 5 seconds. In 2005, which is the latest figures they have, almost 1.4 billion people lived below the international poverty line, earning less than $1.25 a day, $1.25 per day. There's been some improvement since that, but then with the financial crisis, that's falling again. And really, when you go through this and you see that in 2006, about 9.7, almost 10 million children died before they reached their 5th birthday. I was told when I went to Rwanda, if you ask a mother there how many children she has, she'll say, "Ask me after their 5th birthday," because they really don't know how long the children are going to survive. So I thought, well, I would like to learn more about this and to learn about how we in the European Union can do something about this. And what I was really pleased to find is that the European Union is, of any region in the world, really engaged with this issue, really serious about this issue. We're not as effective as we might be. The member states don't meet their 0.7% by and large. Some do, some exceed it. We don't. And when there's a need to cut back on budgetary spending, we're the first people to do that, as we've done yet again here in Ireland. But 57% of all development aid comes from the European Union. I think about in the European Union itself and the member states. I think about 15% or something of that kind. Koos Richelle would know the actual figure. Comes directly from the Commission. We are a serious player in the whole area of development aid, but we've so much more to be done. But not only are we engaged in terms of aid to the developing world. Some people say aid doesn't work. Aid does work. After the end of the Second World War, the death rate for children at birth in this country was 45 per 100,000 births. It's now, I think, something like 2 or 3. In Africa, it's 70 per 100,000, but it's coming down. We can get that down to the numbers that it was in Ireland at the end of the Second World War, and we can get it down further. We can achieve those things. So what happened when I went into the Parliament was that there was a good Cork man. I always ask the advice of a Cork man if you're in any doubt, who was working for the committee, and I said, "Look, I want to learn more about how this whole thing works in detail." And he said to me, "Well, what you need to do," he said, "is don't take any reports until the Development Cooperation Instrument, as it came to be known, comes up, because he said this is going to be the mother and father of all regulations, and if you can get the rapporteurship for that," he said, "it will really take you into the detail of it." In any event, I did, as he said, and despite the fact that I was a new boy on the block, I did get the rapporteurship for it. I was one of the people who were involved in negotiating this that knew very little about the detail of how development aid works, but I knew a lot about politics. And what we did was we put together, within the Development Committee, a task force of the European People's Party, the Christian Democrats, and the Socialist Party, and the Liberals, and others. And we got around the table, perhaps a few of us that are around this table here, and we said, look, they're going to try to divide us on this. But we have to ensure that the bottom line, red line items in this, they're not going to have their way with. What are they? And we identified them. And we set up then a negotiating team, which I chaired. All of the other 4 people on that negotiating team, as I said, knew much more about development aid than I did. I knew a little bit more about politics, perhaps learned on the streets of Dublin and in around the Liberties and the Coombe. But we really together, I think, made sure that the Commission and the Council of Ministers knew that we were serious, that Parliament wanted a good instrument. And I've never in my life come under so much pressure ever at any time in any of the legislative processes I've been involved in since I was first elected to the City Council in 79 or the Dáil in 81, as I came during the 2 years that it took, a little over 2 years, to agree to the Development Cooperation Instrument. First of all, the Commission, and it wasn't from the EuropeAid side, but it was DG External Relations who are managing this. They wanted us to change the legal base from 179, which was co-decision, to 181A, which was consultation. I said, not at all. We're Parliament. This is not a residents' association. We co-decide this with the Council, and we're going to continue to co-decide this with the Council. And they said, that's what you think was sort of the attitude. And for 2 years, we come under huge pressure. And each time the Council of Ministers changed, and they changed a number of times during those 2 years, obviously, they wheeled in the new Council, and they would come in with their brief and try and put us under pressure again, not just in that area, but in other areas as well. They wanted to involve, for example, expenditure on immigration control and call that development expenditure. And they wanted to spend money in industrialised countries and call that development expenditure. We said, no, we're not having that. That won't happen. I remember Hilary Benn, when the British took over the presidency, being the latest one wheeled in, and I met him, and he went through this and saying, we've got to get some agreement on this. And I said to him, look, Hilary, would you, as a member of the Parliament, the British Parliament, give up the right of Parliament to make legislation? And he said, certainly not. I said, well, we won't be doing that either. And the sooner there's a realisation about this, the better. But the pressure was horrific. We had trilogue meetings, 1 commissioner, sometimes 2 commissioners. And for 2 years, even within my own group, within the Socialist group, the pressure came on to try to divide Parliament. But Parliament did not divide. We said no. And at the end of the day, we got a really good instrument. And I have to say, in the case of the Council at the end, and the Commission, particularly on the development side in the Commission, there was a realisation that, look, Parliament is right. I have to say, to some extent, I thought with people like Koos Richelle and others, we were pushing an open door. But the agenda that the DG External Relations were trying to push was one which we could not accept. Now, what that tells you is this. People are fearful that the Commission can propose things that the people don't want. The Commission can propose whatever they want. We gave them that power. But it is Parliament and the Council that disposes. We make the law. And we made the law in this case. And if I might say so, I think the DCI, which merged, some people say 13 regulations, but actually it was replaced 16 regulations all into one. In my view, at the end of the day, we got a very good regulation. Not only did we get a legal base of 179, we determined that most of that money would be spent, how it would be spent. We also got agreement coming up to the end when all these regulations were expiring that all of the programme plans for each of the member states that this applied to, all of the regional strategic plans and the country strategic plans would be sent to Parliament at the same time as they were being sent to Council, and then we would adjudicate on them. And then what happened was, we got this decided in December 2007, and then we said to the Council, OK, send us the plans. And they said, well, how are you going to examine these plans? Or to the Commission, how are we going to examine these plans? Because to examine them, we would have had to set up some structures. So we did. To get subcommittees of the Development Committee would have been extremely difficult. We would have gone through a long process of having to get Parliament to agree and all like that. So what we did was we set up 5 working groups. And those working groups were allocated different areas of responsibility in overseeing the plans that the Commission had on a country-by-country basis, on a yearly basis, then their strategic plans for that country on a longer-term basis, and their strategic plans for the region. And what we did was we set up 5 working groups. Working Group A was based on Central, East and Southeast Asia. But because we had some thematic programs to dispose of, we said, well, look, we have these 5 working groups, so we'll take the themes, the thematic programs, and we'll give one to each of those working groups as well. So the working group A, we gave them the thematic program of investing in people. In working group B, it covered South and West Asia, and we gave them the thematic program of the environment. In working group C, Latin America, North and Central, which I chaired myself, was also given the thematic program of migration and asylum. And then we had working group D dealing with Latin America, South and also South Africa, and that dealt with non-state actors in development. And then we have set up a new working group E, dealing with the food security, food facility regulation, and also humanitarian aid. So the Parliament very quickly structured itself to oversee the implementation of the Development Cooperation Instrument. We became a real player in that. And I have to say, the Commission, in my view, they observed to the letter and to the spirit what we agreed, and they did send those programs. And then we had hearings in advance, and we said, what are you going to do with these? No, we don't want you to do this, we don't want you to do that. And what we got written into the DCI was that 20% of spending will be on basic health and 20% on basic education, and we're now monitoring that to see that this is being done. We're coming up to the midterm review of the DCI, and we will again be meeting with the new commissioner when he's settled in, and with the Commission and the Council to review just where all of this is going. I think what that tells you is this. First of all, Europe is a big player. We are committed. We've more to do, much more to do, but Europe is a big player. Secondly, Europe has set objectives. Thirdly, the 3 institutions are working together to try to achieve those objectives. And lastly, there is accountability. We in Parliament have the structures to call to account the Commission and the Council. And I have to say, I find, and I have found, and I'm not just saying this because Mr. Richelle is here, that they have been very cooperative. And I found him in particular always very accessible and very cooperative in trying to assist Parliament in doing the business of Parliament. When I was a member of the Dáil, a lot of what takes place in the Parliament takes place behind closed doors with civil servants here in the Dáil. Actually, when people talk about the democratic deficit, I'm not saying anything here I haven't said. MEPs have the right of access to the European Affairs Committee, and I've said this twice on the record in recent times. The real democratic deficit is between the Dáil and the people, not the European Parliament and the people. European Parliament members go out there and they do actually act as legislators. If we don't communicate back what we're doing, it's because we simply don't have the medium to do it, and it's very hard to get the media interested in that sort of detail we're involved in. And that, again, is not a criticism. It's quite understandable. It doesn't sell newspapers and it's hard to make it interesting. But I compare this, for example, to the work of the judges. Judges make the state work day in, day out. If they weren't there, we would have chaos. But the only reports that get into the paper are the reports of murder and rape cases, because they're the ones that people take an interest in. And I think we have to get to the stage where we don't believe that people are successful as politicians simply because they're on the media, but that we actually do give some credence to the fact that people are involved in acting and working as legislators when they are sent out to the Parliament. Now, people might say, well, what's the significance of an MEP going out there and working in the development world? Shouldn't he be working or she be working for the constituents who sent them there? Well, I'm on 2 committees. I'm on the, if I chose to go on one of the development committee, in which I'm now the joint coordinator for the EPP, and also it's joint coordinator. I'm no longer vice president to the ACP EU, but I am the joint coordinator for our group, which is the biggest group, to the ACP EU Assembly as well. I chose to do that because that is the work of a legislator. And I also chose to do it because I tried to, when I said I'm going to do this externally, I need to do something internally. So I got myself involved with the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, which is very important to Ireland, you know, the jobs in Dublin in particular, and my constituency. But what we do in the developing world is also relevant to my constituents here. The whatever the figure is, 6.6 billion people or whatever, I don't know what the exact figure is on the face of this earth at present. By 2050, the forecasts are that population will have increased by 2 billion people. And 90% of those will be born into what is now the developing world. These are our neighbours. I read you out some of the figures. They're a short journey away by plane. If we do not, for selfless reasons, interest ourselves in the developing world, for selfish reasons, we should. If what is happening in the developing world continues to happen, in terms of some of the figures I gave you at the beginning about children and hunger and death and all of that, that continues to happen, you're going to have massive migration from south to north, quite naturally, just like in the famine, all our people got out and went off to the United States, wherever else they went to. And it may well be, if we don't do something about it, the cause of a third world conflagration. So I won't go on much longer. There are other people who want to speak. But can I just say two other things to you? First of all, I think that the passing of the Lisbon Treaty is going to be important for us. Mirjam deals with this in her book. I actually photocopied the pages and left them behind me today, but I note what you say, I think it's 286 and 287 of your book, about how the Parliament and the Commission and the Council and the European Union more generally will be much more organised, much better organised to play a role in the world. At present, people say we've got 2 or 3 spokespersons on foreign affairs. We have 5 different people speaking on foreign affairs. We have a Commissioner for Development, one for External Relations. We have the Chairman of the GERC, the General Affairs and the External Relations Council. We have the permanent representative in the Council and for security and external issues. And we have the rotating Chairman of the European Council. It's all over the place. If we get ourselves better equipped institutionally, and we have the basic law, and we have the resources, we can play a far better role in the world. 2 last things. One is, some people ask me, what's the Lisbon Treaty about? If you said it in one word, what it's about, and I say in one word, it's about China. And say, oh, what does that mean? And well, look, China is powerful and becoming more powerful. The United States is powerful and will remain powerful. Russia is becoming more and more powerful. India and Brazil are on the move. By that 2050 date that I mentioned to you there, we will be 6% of the world's population. We cannot continue to be as disorganised as we are, or we will not keep our place in the world. Not only will we not keep our place in the world, we won't be organised to help those who need a help. Not a handout, but a hand up. For their sake and for our sake, we need really to get organised to do that. I'm glad to see that the Swedish president, and I'll finish on this, the Swedish presidency, and indeed Sweden has shown the lead in many ways in what can be done in Europe, or in the developing world. The Swedish presidency is organising 2 days in Stockholm in October, Development Days, to try to push this agenda during its presidency. Pity they won't be there for, or at least the chairman of the European Council won't be there for 2.5 years, because I don't know whoever comes in on the 1st of January next, will they have the same interest in pursuing this agenda. But the Swedes do have a particular interest and can have a particular interest. We should be very proud about what Europe is trying to do in the developing world. Of course we're making mistakes. Of course there's a lot that still has to be done. Of course we have to start getting member states to meet their 0.7 commitment. But we are way ahead of the posse. I think it's less than 0.2% of US budget goes on development aid, and most of that I think goes to Israel. So Europe is ahead of the posse, and we should be really appreciate that, and the aid that they are giving does work. The number of people dying from malaria has come down, and we can get that right down. There are issues that we can and have been addressing. If we get the institutional arrangements right, and if there is a will in the European Union to ensure that we provide the resources, I think we could make even a greater impact in what is happening in the developing world. And I mentioned China, and I'll finish on China. It is this. Some people are concerned about China in Africa. China went into Congo recently, and they negotiated for cobalt and copper and all of this, and in return they said, we built so many miles of lines, of train lines, and so many hospitals. I don't know whether they're going to get the nurses for these hospitals later. I hope they do, and various things of that kind. Well, that's fine. They did that deal with them, and that's a good deal. They don't ask any questions about human rights. We are obliged to ask questions about human rights. We have to be careful about how we do it, because people don't like to be lectured, transferring our cultural norms to their cultural norms. But also they don't ask any questions about governance. And I think the question of governance and how people are governed in the states that we are assisting is really something that we do have to continue to plough away at. But again, in the European Union, uniquely among all the states of the world, we have the African, Caribbean, Pacific EU Assembly. It's a full assembly. When we go to these meetings, it's reported in the newspapers we're on junkets. Actually, we go there to work twice a week. Twice a year we meet, once in the presidency in Brussels and once in one of the ACP countries. We have a full assembly like a parliament. Usually meets two houses together, but it can meet in two houses separately. We have 3 committees under that, one dealing with political affairs, one dealing with social affairs, one dealing with economic affairs, where the MEPs from those MPs in those parliaments are involved with the MEPs from Europe, where we have commissioners and ministers along, and they answer questions, and we work together to try to commonly set the agenda. No other region in the world has that sort of arrangement. Of course it's imperfect. We have to work to improve it. But the good news is that there, in my view, is within the institutions a will to do that, so long as we can keep their feet to the burner. So thank you very much indeed.
If you see the important work he has already done in bringing focus but also reinforcing the position of European Parliament in the Development Cooperation Instrument, and something he didn't mention, the food security regulation by which we send out a bill, I should be downright afraid for what he can do if he finally starts to understand development cooperation. But the second one, it's difficult for anyone in the world to understand development cooperation. For the eye, we have an agreement on policies, and we have an agreement on what should be done. We promise each other to do these kinds of things, but there's still a lot of work to do. And I'm certainly not going to undermine the positive tone of the previous speaker, but I think it could be very much worthwhile in providing you with some challenges that we have in development cooperation, and challenges that will come before us rather quickly at the moment. I will, to save time, immediately go to the substance. It was already mentioned, the European Union is the largest donor in the world. We are responsible for more than 60% of all development aid. That is the official development assistance as accounted for by the OECD Development Assistance Committee. To compare, the United States provides 22%. But let's be honest, the United States is one decision center. We are 28 decision centers. 27 member states plus the European Commission. And in the treaty since Rome, it is said that development cooperation is an issue of complementarity. So the member states and the Commission are both encouraged to do development cooperation in such a way that they don't hinder each other. Meaning you can take your own decisions as long as you're not in the way of somebody else. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges that is before us. If we talk about efficiency and effectiveness of our aid, then you have to come to the conclusion that sometimes donors are in competition with each other to really spend the money. And for the development banks in the different member states, they are crowding each other out. There's in fact too much money available for them, for the number of projects, economically viable projects that are being offered right now. We are facing a serious problem. The Commission is then the second largest donor of humanitarian aid after the United States. And we are, as such, the third largest bilateral, you could say. But what is the difference with all the bilateral donors in the Union is that we, by law, have to work in 140, 50 countries and regions all over the world. All the lists where we have to work are attached to all the regulations that are in place, and we cannot afford to say, well, we withdraw from this country. We have to stay there, whatever happens in such a country. We've made promises on the 0.7% of GDP. In fact, this is one of the features why I call donor land sometimes Disneyland, because we've made this promise to go to 0.7% of GDP already for a very long time, for decades, and there were only 4 idiots doing it. It was Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands. And the rest promised and then went home and did nothing. Now in Monterrey in 2002, we again promised and said, and now we are going to make a time frame and a path toward it. We make a step in between in 2010, and then in 2015 we should be at the 0.7. Well, you see that meanwhile, I see that here the names of the countries are not under it, but that Luxembourg has come up to the 0.7. That is now the 5th country. The other ones are still in the process of getting there, and Ireland was nicely engaged in this process. A tremendous increase in the budget, together with Spain, the biggest grower in budgets, but also possibly at threat at the moment, as I understand, because budget cuts cannot be excluded or are really decided upon. Apart from countries that really decide to lower their budget, we will see an automatic decrease of development cooperation in absolute terms, because the aid is linked to the GDP. And if the GDP decreases, then of course the net and actual contribution in money of the countries will decrease. It might be, I didn't make the calculation myself, but I was informed that in the Netherlands this will cause a fall of more than 400 million euros in 1 year, because the GDP went down with 5.1%. The cynical part of this is that if you decide to stay on the same level, you will increase as a percentage of GDP. So you will see countries now where they will go up to 6.2% even, while in fact there's nothing new, there's no money coming up. I think we will have a big problem in 2010. We will have this millennium goal revisited in a UN conference to explain to the world what we are doing in Europe and how this works out and how much priority we are really giving to the poor people in the world. But as such, as I said, Ireland was one of the 2 biggest growers indeed. And it was realized in a very satisfying way. These are a few of the remarks of the OECD DAC peer review. You know that all the donors are reviewing each other every 2 years, and the remarks made on Irish aid were rather positive, varying from an enhanced policy coherence, an enormous increase in the funding, and a clear focus on poverty reduction in what was done. So everybody was happy. Back to the European level, this is the amount of money that is spent. It is, as you can see, 9% of the budget of the European communities that is spent on external issues. And from that, the right and the lower part are administered by my Directorate General for EuropeAid. And you see there are 2 different slides, because since 1958 the European Development Fund is still an extra budgetary fund. That is a fund where the democratic control is not perfect. And together with Parliament, the Commission has fought already 5 times now to get it budgetized, be it part of the budget, so that Parliament could deploy its full role. And to be honest, Member States should be a little bit less intergovernmental in decision-making in this whole thing and make it up for public scrutiny. But until now, the Member States have blocked this. And there's an official reason and a real reason. The official reason is that if you put it in the budget, then it would be fungible. Under stress, the budgetary authority could decide to use it for other things than for development cooperation. You could better protect it when it is in a separate fund. Well, that could be done now already with the money available for development cooperation. If Parliament would like to do that and they get an agreement with the Council, they can already do the lower part that you see there, the budget parts for Asia, Latin America, Central Asia. They could already use it for other things, for security measures or whatever. But they don't do it. The real reason is that the contributions of the Member States to the European Development Fund follow a different division key than the budget. Traditionally, some countries pay much more to the European Development Fund. France is the example. Than is the case for other countries. The United Kingdom has relatively an easy ride in the European Development Fund for the moment. But also for Ireland, the percentage that is contributed for the European Development Fund is a little bit lower than for the budget key. This is where we spend the money, and the attention is, of course, immediately drawn by the 3.7 billion. That is for Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. But don't forget that that is 78 countries. And if you look at another area, the neighborhood, that is 1.6 billion, and those are 17 countries. And there's a totally different philosophy with our neighborhood policy, because that is really put up to bring security in the belt of countries just surrounding the European Union, from Algeria through the Middle East up to Georgia and Ukraine. A different concept, but a lot of money, relatively speaking, for 17 countries. So when we talk about the priorities of the European Union, you always have to take this into account. Very important in this all is that most of our budgets are geographic budgets. That's the biggest amount of money. You saw that in the previous slide. And that is what we spend through governments. We cannot go directly to local authorities. Usually we have to spend it through governments. But there's a large part also that is reserved for cooperation with non-state actors. It's not the easiest part, I must say, from a point of view of management, but also from a point of view of priority setting. Here, I dare to discuss with the NGOs, but also with Parliament, the essence of what we do over here. We have these separate budget lines for non-state actors, and there is an inclination not to really program it, because we should not determine what should happen on the local level. We cannot know all the needs, and it should be a proposition from the NGOs themselves. So we don't program. And basically, our calls for proposals, when we publish and say, come on, NGOs, they are whoever in the world has a brilliant idea on whatever development, let him or her come forward with his idea. Meaning that you get more than 1,000, sometimes more than 2,000 proposals, totally incomparable, covering all kinds of developments. They have to be compared with each other. It's apples, pears, but even tiles, you could say. It cannot be compared with each other. And then we select 100 or something, which are the best in the ideas of the evaluators, and they get rewarded. So sometimes more than 1,000 are frustrated in this whole process. And in terms of political accountability, what did you do in the end with the money? Yeah, you put a few NGOs at work to do interesting things. But how could you report on this? Did you do something? For instance, if we do human rights, why wouldn't we do in 1 year children's rights? And more in particular, the rights of children in slum cities. Then you have something that you can show. There's also visibility you can do. But if it's just human rights wildly, you can have all kinds of things in it, of course. Well, we were a bad donor at the end of the last century. There was really a lot of criticism, but we have compensated that, I think, and we see a steady upward trend. This is the commitments, that is promises made, that is also interesting, but these are the payments, and that is more interesting, because this is really delivering on the promises made. We are still known as a slow donor, a cumbersome donor, a regulatory donor, and so on. But thanks to all the member states who have agreed to our financial regulations and the cumbersome procedures and so on, we have made 165 proposals for simplification. 1/3 has already been killed by our DG budget and the legal service, 1/3 by the member states, and the other third by Parliament. Because they don't want us to be too creative and take too many decisions. They want to control everything, and that is what they get, a control on everything, and that takes a bit of time. Now, this is in a graph, again, the presentation of a slide I showed you before, and these are these horizontal programs. You see the thematic programs that have been put in place, so human rights, gender, investing in people, health, these kinds of programs. I will not go into depth right now. What we try to do is give development cooperation also a little bit more European face. And for that reason, we have created a few, one could say, facilities. And member states could contribute to this. This is not really a success at the moment. Member states still have the inclination that if they want to shovel money out visibly for something big, they do it with the UN trust funds or the World Bank trust funds. They have some criticism on the speed and so on, but this political discussion about wouldn't it be nice to also have a European face to these kinds of things is not really going off. We have a difficulty in this. The one that functions best is the EU ACP Peace Facility, first very much criticized because we used European development money to work on peace and security. Everybody agreed that there could not be development without peace, but nobody wanted to pay for the peace. So we've taken this initiative a few years ago and said, let Africans solve African problems on African soil. Cynically, that would also prevent body bags coming home from Africa to the EU member states. That was also one of the arguments used at that time. Now, we've invested 250 million, shouting ministers for development during these discussions, but in the end they've topped it up. And now for the 10th European Development Fund, we have decided, or the member states have decided altogether, to put 300 million aside, and voluntary contributions are already coming in for tens of millions. So that is the one that functions best in this way. We also try to modernize, to promise developing countries more money on a structural basis. That's why we invented these Millennium Development Goals contracts. Basically, we tell them, if you stay on track with the promises you made, you promised to so many children to school, this in health, and so on, then we will stay with you for 6 years, and you know the amounts that you get over the 6 years in advance. We put it in a contract, and we've signed it. They have to stay on track, otherwise the contract is off, of course. And that is, something that draws the attention. But there is this pressure, and it will also be in this country, to use development money also for other things, let's say, than the traditional development cooperation. We are called upon to contribute for measures in the area of migration. Not only paying for the first year of reception of asylum seekers, which is in line with the definitions of the ODA, but also keep them back so that they don't come here. In that respect, there is an integral migration center in Mali. It was a political concept, an experiment to put it in place. It had the idea that people that wanted to migrate to Europe would first pass through Mali and get the information why they shouldn't try to immigrate to Europe. Counseling out was one. And then the member states could have those billboards announcing what kind of temporary work they had available. And if the people that were there in the center were not, didn't have the right skills, they could have a quick skill training over there. So it's a bit of everything in this concept. In the start, it drew enormous attention. Then we had a period where only the director of the center and the doorman were available. Then there was a new period where people coming back, they were kicked out of their jobs in our countries, and they went back, and then they used this center for reintegration. That was a few months, and now you see that there is a steady stream of people still wanting to go there, but our labor markets have collapsed, so there's not much temporary job offers over there. We also try to co-finance with member states. That is possible in our financial regulation, and we have now 300 million from European money spent through bilateral donors and 250 million coming back. Basically, let me give you one example. In Haiti, we were doing a road, and the French said we had 28 million, I think, available for that road. Please, Commission, do the work. You're already there, you have the contacts and the contracts. So you do the work, and we just make a virement on your account, and then you can do the work. And the other way around. It is still too much small work, contracts of 2 million, 4 million, 8 million, and so on. And that is not really contributing to the issue of division of labor, something that we have promised in the framework of the Accra Agenda, then we should say, you do the work and we withdraw from a country because you are there. And this cross-country division of labor is nowhere. It's a political issue, it's not a technical issue, and the wrong people are in the room. There's bureaucrats discussing the division of labor, and it should be politicians discussing it. And we try to get it on the political agenda. It's not only about more and faster, it's also about quality. And we have put a whole system together for quality checks at the moment. Basically, before a project starts, during its lifetime, 3-4 times, it's been visited by external consultants according to a standard model. They cannot just feel that the project is good. They have to do the arguments, the check, and so on. And on the basis of that, we know that we have problems in 6% of our projects, really problems. And combining a few evaluation results, we already know that when a project starts off difficultly, it will never become a good project. So why the hell do we start off difficult projects? Projects that are highly contested, where the people involved differ of opinion. You should do it, you could do it, and so on. We should stop it. Because 6% doesn't seem to be much. You say 94% is okay, but 6% of 8 billion euros per year is a lot of money going down the drain. And we should prevent that from happening. So we are reinforcing the instructions on this. We'd like to move in this Accra agenda with joint monitoring. Not doing everything our own. And one of the strangest things that happened is that every country that wants to do budget support analyzes a developing country in its own way and comes to its own conclusions. And then you can have, on the basis of the work done in the same weeks, that one country comes to the conclusion we should stop immediately and withdraw from the country, and another one tops up with 20 million. This is not serious. This shows that what we do is more feelings than based on research and really an integral discussion with each other about the consequences that should be connected to all this. And that leads then to these kinds of figures. If you here look at the aid fragmentation in Bangladesh, you see all the European actors mentioned here, from big to small. They are mostly in the left part of the cake. If we could do the EU as one, then we would have this kind of pictures. The lower part then would be the EU, while if I go back, you see what the EU is now, totally fragmented. This is in fact what we've promised in all these beautiful things like the EU consensus and the communication on the vision of labor, but this is where we really are as the EU at the moment. We are far from realizing this kind of coordinated approaches. We have, and we are very good in this, in development cooperation, identified already completely what we have to do. And on some things, the Irish aid is perfect. Untying of aid, you are totally untied. You are one of the few in Europe that is totally untied with its aid. On the vision of labor, we are all equally bad, meaning we are all over the place. We at least can say that we are there by law, because we have to be there in the regulations. The other ones are there by choice. So how are we going to influence this and come to a division of labor? All these issues must be known to you. Use of country systems. Who is really using country systems? Who dares to have enough confidence in the system of a developing country to entrust them the money? And how to explain that to the taxpayers? Because you still have this idea that budget support, never do it. It's money directly going to Swiss bank accounts. And you shouldn't do it. Nobody needs to deliver the proof. It's just reality. You say it and it is reality. This is what I already talked to you about. The figures are already outdated. We are already over 300 million in delegation agreements, so working through other donors. And we are over 250 million in work that we do for other donors. Ireland is not part of this game. Before we do it, we must check the organization with which we work together, so EuropeAid in this case. This is done by external consultants. EuropeAid did not yet enter a request for that, so they are still on their own. These are a few things again on this DAC peer review, but you see all smileys, so you can be very happy about yourself. The DAC is very confident in you and very satisfied about what's happening over here. Now, the organization, I told you we were seen as a slow donor, so I've organized external consultants comparing us with the Swedes, the French, the Brits, and the Dutch. And then you get this picture. The Dutch are the quickest, which is nice for me because I put it together there at the time also. But the EC is about 120 weeks. It takes 120 weeks to come from the start of the programming to the first decision based on the programming. Because it has to go in preparation, all the strategies and so on, and the annual activity plans. If you take the approval process out, that is specific for us because we are commission, so we have to translate it in so many languages, we have to send it to council, then we have Parliament's involvement in this. This is costing about 20 weeks. So if you take that out, the commission would be, in this comparison, in about 100 weeks. So the idea that the commission is very slow and slower than most of the bilateral donors is not based on reality, if you look at this. Well, I've already mentioned a few of the challenges before us. The aid effectiveness. We, of course, don't know what is going to happen with the new commission. It's in your hands here, basically. So, good luck. We will see on the 3rd of October what happens, and I'm very happy to pick up the positive signals that we get. But in fact, the whole of Brussels is holding back its breath now. For this, we don't want to make any remarks on this, so it stays an enigma until you've done your work. The midterm review that's going on, it has already been mentioned. That's something that, in our idea, should be more or less looking if we are on the right track and not a complete overhaul of what we are doing and a change in systems. We always do that in the midst of a 5-year term, and that has to be done. Well, we don't know what the international crisis will bring, and we don't know what it will bring to developing countries. We have taken in Europe at least 2 measures. One is the food security billion, in which regulation Mr. Mitchell has played the crucial role over there. And the other one is what we call a vulnerability flex measure that is making available 500 million in the years 2009 and 10, in total 500 million, from the ACP reserves, from the European Development Fund reserves. But big questions are before us, and we should discuss them. And I hope that where the budgets are curtailed, people take the opportunity to really discuss the issue as a principle. For instance, it's called here the finalité de l'aide. We never discuss this. When is it enough? What should we do with middle-income countries? When do we stop it? If I tell in some circles where normal people are, that are people that are not involved in development cooperation in my definition, where normal people are, and I tell them that we give money to China to help them with the poor, they start throwing furniture at my head. They say, what the hell are you doing? And why? Yeah, because it's in the instruction. We have to do it, poverty eradication. The same goes for Brazil. Why should we help them cope with the poor Indians in the northwestern part of the country? They should do it themselves. If they pay taxes, they can themselves redistribute and take care of their poor. But also the good ones, like Mozambique, all the donors together pay more than 60% of the national budget of the government. How long are we going to do that? What's the sustainability of that? And what if tomorrow 5 more Mozambiques are there, very good in performance? Are we going to give them 60% of the government budget as well? Where's the economic side of development? When can they take over? Where's the taxation side? And all these difficult questions we never really put to ourselves, but we will be forced to do so. Now, one of the problems that I have in contributing to policy formulation is that there is relatively little contribution from science. You can come in as a minister in development cooperation or as a commissioner and say what my predecessor has done is total crap. I'm going to do it totally different. I go out of 5 countries and in 5 new countries. And basically it's a debate of a few interested people and you can just do what you want. This underpinning of what could and should be done is not so very much present. And that's the reason why I was happy with the book of that, like that of Mirjam van Reisens. The title is a little bit deceptive. It says EU development cooperation after the end of the Cold War. But that's not the only thing you get. Because when you want to understand what happened, you need to go back in history and see how it all came about. And that is exactly what this book is doing as well. It is giving us, from the start of European development cooperation, a bit of a total overview of what happened. And these kinds of books are really needed. What it shows us, and that part of the title is not deceptive, the window of opportunity, is that if things happen, you have like a surfer that sees a wave, you have to jump on it and use it to the maximum. And sometimes people don't see it, and the wave passes. And sometimes the wave is used in a certain way, and this whole process is nicely described in this book, I would say. And you can also see where mistakes were made, or how things were decided, sometimes coincidentally, because people were in a meeting or were not in a meeting, or there was a brilliant idea or there was not a brilliant idea. And that makes a kind of an explanation, forms a kind of an explanation why, contrary to my habit, I decided to write a foreword on this, because I couldn't suppress a bit of enthusiasm when I read the book. It was in an academic sphere that it was produced. Finally, she has finished her studies and has become a doctor, but it is worthwhile reading, I would say. It fits also nicely in as a closure to what I've said in too many words, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Koos, for those comments on the book, and Ronan and Gay. And all of you. It's very much a pleasure to be here in Dublin and to discuss the window of opportunity in development cooperation. This book was first called Logic of Coincidence, and maybe that title would have been more adequate to describe the coincidence of all of us being here today and the debate outside on the street on the yes or no. When I was walking around this morning, I thought that one of the conclusions that was apparent from all these things that are hitting you is that Europe must be so bad that we should all consider migrating to Ireland. But I think that where both of the campaigns are right is that, well, from a European perspective, we would say that Ireland really does matter and has made a difference to the state of the art of development cooperation of the European Union, and therefore to the European Union and the face of the European Union abroad. Everything that I'll be describing is also actually in the book, and outside there are order forms for the book, so you don't actually need to take notes. I thought that I should first start this presentation by tracing the Irish contribution to development cooperation, and that is something that Ireland can really be proud of, and it can be traced with very clear precision. I'm going to just give examples. It's possible to come up with more examples than the ones that I'll be mentioning here. The first is on the treaty itself. Actually, as you know, the first draft of the Lisbon Treaty was concluded in the draft itself in the Irish presidency, and the precision with which the articles that are relevant for development cooperation and humanitarian assistance are written, the way in which they really identify the objective of development cooperation as poverty eradication, applying to developing countries and not to the entire world. Also, the way in which development cooperation relates to other external policies of the European Union. Those drafts were made here in Ireland, and some of those proposals that were drafted by the administration really made a difference to the clarity on development cooperation and humanitarian assistance in the treaty as it stands. And those differences, those legal differences, they actually really matter on the clarity with which the quality of aid can be pursued. And the second example, and Gay has gone in detail, he described it today in detail, and rightly so, because it was a very, very important battle, Gay, that you led, was to make sure that the development cooperation instrument would be exactly in line with that clarity that the treaty had provided even before the treaty was ratified, and as you know, it's still not ratified. So it was a very, very important exercise, and I think that is something that I have been trying to do in the book in general, is that when I went through the history with very, very much detail, I can say, what really struck me is that often these kind of changes really depend on people, and sometimes they even depend on individuals. And very often they depend on a country taking the lead on certain issues. And in Europe, that is definitely a reality. And I think from that historical analysis, it has become very clear that Ireland has been all the time, through different mechanisms, sometimes through the national administration, sometimes through the parliament, sometimes through NGOs, at the forefront of leading that exercise, that European development cooperation has that quality that it focuses on poverty. The other very significant achievement through the European Parliament that Gay led was this exercise of making sure that democratic scrutiny is real, is very real, and that it is really a process of looking at the programs, weighing them against the legal obligations, and then, in most cases, giving the European Commission the green light to go ahead with those programs. And this is very important, of course, not just from a point of view of democracy, but also legitimizing that quantity of EU aid that is quite significant going through the European Commission. And the third example that I wanted to cite here is an initiative also that stems from the Irish presidency in 2004, which is called a presidency fund, coming from the presidency, and which relates back to that very specific thing that happened that year, which was the enlargement of the European Union with 10 member states. And for me, personally, that was really signifying the end of a journey. I started in 1989 looking at what does this big change in East-West relations, what does that mean for Europe, and what does it mean for Europe's role in the world, and more specifically, how does that affect EU development cooperation? And with the enlargement, that of course really was the culmination of the answer to that question. And I'd come to the conclusion, and it's also described in the book, that unfortunately there had been little preparation of new member states in development cooperation, and that this was going to be a big mortgage on the quality of EU development cooperation. And so this was a big concern and a big worry for us. We discussed this with Irish NGOs, we discussed it with DCI, and one of the initiatives that the Irish then took was the proposal of this presidency fund, which then helped initiatives in new member states in EU development cooperation to come to fruition. And we now today can trace that in quite a number of countries such as Bulgaria or Slovenia or Poland, where there was no tradition of development cooperation in a kind of a European Union way of understanding, really have, now they're all small, but small initiatives that have their impact also on the administration and have been very important to make sure that we keep having a basis for development cooperation in Europe. Of course, 12 new member states out of 27 is an important weight on the decision-making structures. So this has been very significant. The key actors for change have been the national administration, the European Parliament, NGOs. The relevance of all of these as actors for change in the European Union can also be very clearly traced. Now, let me say something also about the future challenges, and especially those related to the treaty, and where, in my view, that Irish influence that can be traced in such clear terms will really be needed in the future. The most important negotiation that will be waiting for us if the treaty would move ahead is the European External Action Service. This will be a service that is situated between the Council and the Commission, and it will be essentially a joint diplomatic service. Now, that is good. It's good to have this. It is good to have a clearer face of the European Union outside. It will also be very difficult. All of us know, I suppose, that foreign affairs is not the area of greatest consensus of the European Union. Also, our histories in diplomacy are very different. The orientations of the countries are very different. So, in my view, this is going to be very much a testing ground. First of all, whether there really is a serious effort to get this joint diplomatic service off the ground and it focusing on diplomacy. Secondly, to keep a very clear definition of this service that is based on the treaty. And the treaty is very clear. The treaty makes a very clear distinction between foreign affairs, between security policy, and between communitarian policies, where development and humanitarian assistance are situated. And so it's my view that we should not burden this European External Action Service with development policy, and that actually doing that would really be counterproductive to that exercise of trying to create a greater and clearer face of development cooperation, of the European Union, because development cooperation is an area where there is consensus, where there is European consensus, where it is right for that to be a communitarian policy, and the way in which that is administered should reflect that. The third reason is that it will be very important that the implementation of the treaty, the treaty itself decreases the democratic deficit. The implementation should also be done in that spirit. And for that, it is very important that there's clarity of which policies are communitarian joint policies and which policies are intergovernmental policies. And in the field of peace, security, and foreign affairs, these are governed by the intergovernmental parts of the treaty, and those should not be mixed. And if they are mixed, then it is going to very much complicate some of the achievements that Gay has been talking about, which really have created clear mechanisms for exercising that scrutiny in the field of development cooperation. If I'm saying development cooperation, I mean development cooperation and humanitarian assistance together, both of which should remain in a community part of implementation, which means in practice that the European Commission should be implementing them. It also, I mean, when I was very closely involved in following the negotiations on the treaty at the time of the convention. And one of the drafts that was put forward that didn't make it at the end of the day was very clearly that military expenditure could be taken from development or humanitarian spending. Now, actually, the way that negotiation worked out was very clearly stating the objectives of development cooperation and humanitarian assistance that would not allow that. But hadn't been that clarity provided in the treaty, then the situation today could well be different. And for that, the ratification of the treaty is still very important, because unless this treaty is ratified, that clarity will still not exist. The principles for the arrangement between external relations policies and development cooperation in the treaty, they basically date back from 1991, 1992, the Maastricht Treaty, and that hasn't been changed in the Lisbon Treaty. And again, Irish drafting in that was very important, especially setting out the principle that all the external policies, be it trade, security, development cooperation, have to be consistent with each other. And that's a horizontal principle. It means that they can all stand next to each other, but no one is superior to another. Also, that was not a given. It was something for which there were people who were standing for that and who put up a fight. None of this came automatic. The definition of development cooperation to developing countries is defined by the principle of coherence. Coherence comes next to consistency. Consistency is clearly saying that all the policies stand next to each other. Coherence says that in developing countries, the development objective of poverty eradication should be taken into account. So it gives an extra imperative to the development objectives in those countries. But there is nowhere in the treaty, absolutely nowhere, where it would suggest that foreign policy or security policy has a greater importance than development cooperation. Actually, you could argue quite the contrary, in a strictly legal sense. With regards to the quantity of EU aid, what I could show through the book and I thought was really quite interesting, is that where the member states' aid flows are in many countries going with the tide, especially with the economic tide, the EU, the aid that goes through the European Commission has actually been very stable, and often through those difficult periods has even increased. So the European Union has been a very important buffer for developing countries, especially in times of uncertainty, maybe even fear. That was the case post-1989, where many of the developing countries were very concerned that a lot of the resources would flow eastwards. It's again the same situation now with the financial crisis and the pressures on the internal budgets. The EU provides a certain consistency and predictability there for developing countries, which I would see as very important. Well, that brings me to my final comments. Many have asked what the window of opportunity is of the financial crisis. And I want to make one comment about China, since both Gay and Koos also refer to it, and which has been very present in the development debate lately. One of the very interesting developments in China has been, after the financial crisis, that the top of the government in China has been discussing how it can create a predictability and communicate that certainty to citizens in China of social security throughout their lives, especially also as people are aging. Because one of the things that is really a problem in China is that everybody is saving and nobody is spending. And where the exports were becoming a problem through the financial crisis, the Chinese economists realized that the internal market became really very important. So what you can see is that some of the values that are very essential to the construction, I would say, of the European community are now finding a reflection in the context of the financial crisis in countries such as China. And in my view, we should seize upon that. And whether you call that aid or whatever, I don't really care. But what I can see is that it is that as Europeans we have an interest in that development in China. It's good for our business, but it's also very good for our social standards. And we should be engaging with the Chinese on how to do that. And moreover, we have a lot of experience on how that can be done. And so I think that those debates should take place. And I think that they are very relevant to the aid debate. And in that context, we must move forward on those policy debates with China. Well, the aid budgets are obviously under pressure, so that stability that the European Commission will give to those budgets remains very important. And I would really, through the examples that I have given today, urge you to consider the importance of that fight for a good European policy, and that it really does impact in a very real way on the quality of EU policy, and that all of us have a responsibility to make sure that that happens, and that those efforts, like for instance of Gay, really find support in the Parliament. Well, with that, I think I will finish. I could say more on the comments that have been made on budgetization, on other things, but I would like to leave that to the questions and to hear a little bit what you want to discuss further. Again, Jill had asked me to announce the books for viewing are outside on the table. You can also find it on Amazon. There are order forms. And I also copied an article that was written, I think they're enough for everybody, on the institutional arrangements, because I thought that was relevant, especially if we look at the next phase of European development aid, if the treaty gets an endorsement here in Ireland. Thank you very much.